Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Everybody, thank you for coming to our inaugural Digital Humanities session. This is a brand new sub-theme for Microsoft External Research. We're really excited to have Tara McPherson and Amit Ray here to talk to us today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the future of publishing and the future of collaboration. Our first speaker is going to be Tara. And Tara is the Associate Professor of Gender and Critical Studies at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. She's the founding editor of the Vectors Journal of Culture and Technology in a Dynamic Vernacular, which is a great online journal. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you check it out. It's a multimedia peer-reviewed journal. Her other work in new media includes serving as editor of Digital Youth, Innovation and the Unexpected, part of the MacArthur Foundation series on digital media and learning. And she was recently selected as one of 3 editors for the new MacArthur-supported International Journal of Learning and Media, which is forthcoming from MIT Press. Oh, actually, it already came out. She was one of the founding organizers of Race and Digital Space, a multi-year project supported by the Annenberg Center for Communication and the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. Her new media research focuses on issues of convergence, gender, and race, as well as upon the development of new tools and paradigms for digital publishing, learning, and authorship. And with that, I'd like to introduce Tara McPherson.
Better? Can you hear me now? I think it's a really good moment to have humanities scholars in conversation with technologists, and that a kind of two-way conversation might be very useful. As the bio suggested, I'm not a computer scientist nor an engineer. How many of you are computer scientists or engineers? I'm just curious if anybody actually came from those categories, all right? And how many people would identify themselves as humanities type? You know, probably everyone at the conference is in the room, right? And librarians, usually a few librarians in the mix, right? Okay, I just like to know who my audience is, right? In my sort of more traditional scholarly work, I study narrative and images and contemporary theory, artifacts of human culture, right? So, but lately, by a weird turn of coincidences, for about a decade, I've been involved in exploring new possibilities for scholarly publishing, and particularly in the digital mode. And since that's happened, my audience is likely to be technologists, librarians, archivists, foundation folks as humanities scholars. And while the work I'm doing with the team at USC and now with a team that spans the country is really work meant to move technology forward, our motivations are not technological. Our motivations are the kind of motivations that drive humanities research. Often humanities scholars who are quite allergic to technology for anything else besides, library searches, email, or webcasting. And those are questions around things like the status of the body in the world, right? Questions of the emotions, of visuality, of the meaning of narrative, right? The kind of terrain humanities scholars typically explore. And my use of digital platforms and my interest in digital scholarly publishing is really motivated by helping humanities scholars, and I think other scholars as well, answer questions like that better. And I think that if we don't sort of close the gap between the people who asked ethical and epistemological and even ontological questions about the status of the human with those who are building technological systems were probably existing in separate realms pretty much at our peril. Most humanities scholars are not, particularly interested in the Terra grid. Most of them couldn't imagine how they would use it for their scholarship in the first place, right? But they do begin to recognize that there are certain ways they'd like to express their scholarly research that increasingly strains against the linear spine of the print book, right? And they're exploring sort of new methods of what they might be able to do. Along that, kind of stretch of time, we've seen a really kind of rampant explosion in the availability of online journals, right? In the mid-1990s, I was a pre-doc at MIT before I went to USC, and remember a student coming into my office and showing me this thing called the World Wide Web. And caught up in sort of the hype of MIT at the moment, I was very enthusiastic about the way teaching and scholarship might change circa 1995, right? And some things clearly have changed. The rate of online publication is pretty substantial. Clearly the amount of vernacular media on the web has exceeded pretty much all expectations. That rate of sort of Flickr accumulation, I think, is really kind of staggering, right? And at the same time, scholars have access to really vast amounts of what in the humanities we would probably call evidence, and we'd look for it in an archive. Scientists might call it data, and they'd look for it in their data sets, right? But this is a really good example of a super rich humanities data set, right? The Shoah Foundation archive is nearly 52,000 testimonies of Holocaust survivors. It comprises hundreds of thousands of hours of video, and it's one of the largest digital libraries in the world. It exceeds 8 petabytes, right? So its raw data is bigger than the data on that nice map Tony Hayes showed us this morning, the kind of calculating problem involved in it. And that's a humanities data set, right? And we're trying to figure out, what we might productively do with this material. Now scholars typically go to one of the locations in the world where you can access this material, because right now it's not open, watch the videos, and then write a traditional scholarly article or book about it. But to me, that doesn't seem maybe the best way to make use of this data set. While much scholarship has gone online in the statistics we saw earlier, it hasn't really changed form very much, right? Typically, it's still, at best, text with pictures, right? There might be a moving image embedded in there somewhere. Almost always text, video were used to kind of illustrate the argument carried in the text as kind of prettiness, right? Not as an integral element of the communicative force of the thing being communicated, right? So I'm particularly interested in how we might take those popular vernaculars of the internet, YouTube, Facebook, other spaces, and really begin to apply those in our scholarly practices in new ways, while also thinking about how those data sets might change our scholarly outputs in some way, right? Is the best thing to really do with 52,000 video testimonies to write more books about them for close communities of 200 peers, or 400 is the average reader of a humanities monograph, right? What might we do so that our analyses and writing live organically and more seamlessly with the data sets or evidence or archives that our arguments are spawned by or based in? Is there a way to kind of integrate that workflow in more interesting ways? And I think we have a lot to learn from the humanities in a space like this, because the humanities really, in the last decade that the web has really taken off and Flickr and YouTube have exceeded our expectations, the humanities have spent a lot of time thinking about questions like the emotions and their impact on how we understand image or the narrative, narrative, right? The body, what is the status of embodiment across many platforms, right? You might say that while Microsoft's been building Connect with full body tracking, scholars, some of whom are in this room, have been doing full body tracking and full emotion work in the scholarly register of the humanities, right? Really theorizing and beginning to understand the impact of the body and the emotions in ways that might translate productively to our scholarly practices, right? So there's a lot of work from the humanities that has potential feedback loops into technological development right now. There is a really good opportunity to also begin to think about the mutability of data, allowing us multiple interfaces into the same data set, right? So this is a project TextMap, which actually is drawing the same data sets into these different kinds of visualizations at once, right? And it's often quite illuminating to humanities scholars to begin to realize that the data or the evidence or the archive they work with doesn't only have to have one interpretation, right? But that it might be visually and narratively interpreted for different communities of use and for different impacts. And beginning to help humanities scholars understand this kind of mutability of digital data is really one of the areas we've been quite focused on lately. So what I've been doing for about the last 8 years is working with a series of collaborators, primarily at USC in the School of Cinematic Arts in the George Lucas building, right, on thinking about what multimodal scholarship might be, right? What would it mean to kind of really harness computational power for humanities scholarship at a variety of different levels? To really think about what it means to have the expression of your idea, its form, really organically or seamlessly relate to its content, right? We take the form of humanities scholarship, the peer-reviewed article, the single-authored monograph, pretty much for granted, but there's no reason that is the only way we might express our outputs, right? How might expression and idea cohere better? What kinds of relationships to evidence might we explore differently in these platforms? And in particular, what might we learn not only from sort of user interface or design, but also from artistic practice, from experimental practices about new shapes and sort of livelier forms of writing? How we could really bring our data to life in our scholarship in interesting ways. So today, I'm going to talk primarily for a few minutes about what we might understand to be the long tail of experiments in digital publishing. The very kind of wacky journal I edit called Vectors, which is unusual and opaque and a little quirky, right? And then based on what we've learned from several years of working on vectors, I want to explore a little bit how we might scale vectors into a broader set of working practices and workflows for scholarship. So in moving toward multimodal scholarship, Vectors takes really seriously questions like, what would it be like to play an argument like you might play a video game? How can we take the kind of emotional residue of filmmaking and layer that into scholarly knowledge production? To really explore the kind of affective or sensory or emotional registers that scholarship might take. And what happens when you take humanities scholars who, at least in their rewarded and privileged scholarly output, are typically kind of solitary monastic creatures who like the single byline and sole credit, right? And in the work they get rewarded for are typically not deeply collaborative creatures. What happens if you put those people together, not only with another English professor from the office next door, but with a programmer or a really highly skilled interactive designer, right? What might happen then? And what happens when you do that is vectors. Vectors began as an experiment at my university in promoting sort of multimodal scholarship. My dean, on a good day, said, well, you know, if you are enjoying teaching with multimedia, why don't you do your scholarship in it? And I said, because there'd be no place I could publish it where I would ever get credit. And she said, well, why don't we start a journal? So we did. And this is it. So from the very beginning, I'm just going to show you a couple of things. There's some familiar faces in here, and I know many of you have seen vectors before, and I want to move on to talk about some experiments we're doing now. But from the very beginning, you have to interact with the interface. You could write your name, just to kind of begin from the outset to get a sense that this is not a journal as usual, right? It's not going to give you a PDF, most likely, right? The table of contents for this issue is here. I'm just going to show you the pieces. One of the criticisms and one of the joys of vectors is that every piece is a one-off. We produce the pieces in deep collaboration between an editor, a technologist, a very talented media artist, and the scholar who's bringing a problem to us. They begin in a summer boot camp, and they extend the work process over 6 months. Some of the tools and platforms are kind of continually reused, but each interface is precious and boutique-y, right? It's not easily scaled to kind of massive, communities of humanities scholars. But it afforded us a lot of really interesting possibilities. So one of the problems as a user or a reader of vectors is that when you come to the projects, each one has an interface that demands attention. It demands care, right? You're not going to probably figure it out as intuitively as the 5-year-old, 8-year-old Noah this morning figured out how to drive the digital car, right? One of our arguments is that there's actually a benefit to slowing down the pace of the digital and its transparency and its ease, and having to learn a new interface is part of the process of engaging the material. So vectors might be seen as analogous to experimental art, something you'd find in Los Angeles at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and not what you'd find at LACMA, realist paintings, where that's a bowl of fruit, right? This is sort of a different genre, right? So this is a piece called Public Secrets. It's a scholar, Sharon Daniel, who works in prison reform and digital media and filmmaking. And she has, over time, collected a fairly vast archive, about many, many hours, about 600 pieces of sound, of interviews and testimony with women incarcerated in the largest women's prison in California, Chowchilla. And she works as well with an organization, Justice Now, that's a prison abolitionist group, right? And she wanted to create a piece that didn't, in a sort of HBO prison movie kind of way, give you access to the women in prison, right? There are no lesbian love scenes in Sharon's piece, right? But that instead really kind of respect the integrity of the women's voices she's working with and pair those with an analysis of the prison industrial complex, right? So she came to us to work out a way to present the women's voices.
A $3 million razor wire fence separates California Correctional Women's Facility from the middle of nowhere. Its site is an agribusiness desert between Los Banos and Chowchilla, where there are 3 prisons within 30 square miles.
Okay, I'm going to skip the intro. Once you get into the piece, it's being algorithmically driven by a kind of tree map structure that's staged at the beginning, right? So the piece is scripted, much like a video game, to allow you certain pathways into the material. But as you begin to explore the piece, more and more of the material opens up to an exploration driven by your own motivations, right? But it begins much the same sort of every time. And the piece loads in the sound of the women, and you hear their excerpts.
I was taking insulin and a pill called glyphosate. And got here, my doctor faxed over my paperwork from Kaiser Permanente.
So you could follow through the narratives in a variety of ways. You can enter through a series of themes to kind of search the piece and explore the kind of thematic arcs that Sharon has constructed through the database. You can...
I knew I was a diabetic prior to even getting incarcerated. I was taking...
You could follow it through keywords. You could hear different women's stories associated with the same ideas. You could follow one woman's story through the pathway. There are a variety of different modes to move you through the piece. And this piece looks entirely different from every other vectors piece. They're each quite experimental and quite different in their scope and design. And it was a fairly luxurious experiment funded primarily by my dean, Elizabeth Daly, to allow us to see what kinds of questions humanities scholars wanted to ask, what kind of applications in that kind of lab environment they might make of new media technologies, and how scholarly publishing might take different kind of sensory forms, right? And the scholars we've worked with have been incredibly enthusiastic. Many have gone on to do new multimedia projects. Many have won grants. Sharon Daniel, who we saw in this Public Secret project, actually was a Webby nominee for that piece, which is not the typical place that your scholarly humanities articles go, to the Webby nominees. We were very surprised by that, right? It's also been exhibited all over the world. It's used by Justice Now in their activist mentions. It's used at rallies. It's been shown to the legislature, right? So it begins to illustrate the way humanities insights and scholarly practice might travel to audiences far beyond, say, a journal like Critical Inquiry, right? So Sharon could simultaneously publish in those journals, but a piece like Public Secrets translates, repurposes, mashes up her work for a different set of users and audiences that extends from, the kind of Berlin Film Festival to an activist organization speaking to the California legislature. It's a pretty good range for that project. Across the kind of time we've worked on vectors now, we've started to see some benefits that we could at least anecdotally, but I think also more systemically, begin to build into a next system. First of all, we know that when scholars in the humanities begin to understand what the affordances of databases or algorithms are, they also begin to kind of formulate new types of research questions, right? They begin to think about how they might understand patterns in data, how they might think about the tangential in a new way rather than the linear, right? And that's offered some real possibilities to the scholars we're working with in ways to kind of rethink their scholarly practice. We're also beginning to get an interesting kind of glimpse into the kind of genres that might emerge. While the kind of opacity or experimental nature of some of the vectors interfaces, I think, were troubling to some readers. Some people get really angry about them, right? They were necessary for us to begin to really understand the needs of our community of use, which is, in this instance, humanities scholars, and to know what kind of things they might want to do. One genre that's emerging that's been really fruitful for us is what I might call the animated archive, where scholars begin to realize that their relationship to that data set or that archive of evidence, often a lot of carefully marked up digitized assets, need not be to call out the 4 best examples that then prove their argument, but to allow you to surf multiple pathways through that archive in interesting and illustrative ways. Right? I think that it's kind of commonplace now to talk about the focus on process rather than on product. But I think we learned as much from the things that failed in vectors, and I could tell you a lot of those later if you want over drinks on the boat, as we did from the things that succeeded. Right? Ironically, we learned a lot of things that we didn't anticipate. That scholars who had no technological capacity might have had an easier time stepping into the platform than those who didn't, right? And that I found very interesting. And the collaborations were incredibly rich. And we've learned a lot about how to put together teams with very diverse skill sets and sustain them. We are very committed to kind of building digital platforms that are lightweight, flexible, widget-driven. I have absolutely no faith that there's a turnkey solution tool for the digital humanities. I think that the needs are not consistent enough from one digital example of the humanities to another for one platform to be the be-all and end-all. And then I think it's incredibly important to begin from the needs that the scholars have and not from the tool and what you can imagine it might do. So these are some of the steps we're taking as we kind of move ahead into different directions. After several years of running a 1-week-long summer workshop that then was followed by a kind of extensive collaboration, now with funding from the NEH, we're about to have our second month-long institute starting on the 19th. And scholars will leave at the end of that month with a kind of beta prototype of a project being built in the platform I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. We're working with a variety of partners and through many practices right now, and I'll tell you a little bit about more of those in just a second. We're beginning to think about how you might template some of what we've learned and really begin to scale it. So we're happily in a second round of funding from the Mellon Foundation with a variety of collaborators I'll tell you about, creating what's known as the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture. And this is a research group and development team really beginning to think about how scholars who work primarily with visual materials, in this case we're focused on video, might really begin to model both a human infrastructure for a new scholarly workflow as well as a technological infrastructure, right? So we're partnered with 4 presses, or 4 archives, all of which have vast digital assets. The first is the Shoah Foundation, which conveniently is located at USC. The second is the Internet Archive, but primarily working with their video collections. The third is a very kind of exquisite and odd archive, like the quirky, right, at NYU called the Hemispheric Institute Digital Video Library. And that's a collection across multiple languages of performance art in the Americas, you know, things that are very ephemeral and likely to be lost, but that performance study scholars use as their data set. And the fourth is a bottom-up archive that might best be analogized to a YouTube for media study scholars called Critical Commons that was created by my collaborator, Steve Anderson, with MacArthur funding, where media studies scholars could load their video for research or teaching into this platform and skirt all those nasty fair use issues that so plague our scholarly imaginations, right? So those partners are working with us to deliver rich content, carefully marked up, already digitized, to a platform that we're building that I'll tell you about. And at the other end of that process, 3 university presses. Those presses are MIT, California, and Duke have agreed to publish the experiments of what we produce in this kind of new mode of scholarly publishing. So a group of collaborators, Wendy Chun, who's here from Brown, Nick Mirzoff from NYU, Joan Saab from Rochester, and Brian Goldfarb from UC San Diego, have been working in this Mellon project through 2 rounds of funding now with the development team at Vectors. And the model we're working on kind of began out of a prototype last summer in the summer workshop by a media studies scholar named Alex Uhas. And Alex came to some fame or notoriety when she taught an entire class at Pitzer in YouTube about YouTube. You might have seen her being mocked on the news and interviewed, right? So her students studied, she's a media scholar with a tradition of media activism, and she feels like YouTube, while it's called YouTube and is meant to be democratic, is anything but, right? And she had her students explore all the structural, technological reasons why YouTube is limited as an exercise in democratic media making. And she wanted to publish a book based on this. But the book intricately interweaves the videos. There are hundreds of videos in the piece. The argument sometimes is carried entirely in the video, not in the text, right? It's not as if the text explicates the video. So you needed both parts together. So what she's created with our team very quickly last summer in a couple of weeks is a series of tours that begin to lay out these arguments, right? And you could follow them in a very linear way, just clicking through, or you could move through a variety of different search mechanisms. You could look for everything about capitalism and see those tours. You know, you could move through her students, through different tagging. There's very little here now that lets the user add in, but Alex is sort of happy with this piece where it's at. It's now been sent out for traditional peer review by MIT Press. It will be published by MIT Press on their website this fall. And we've learned a lot with our press partners about everything from how you rethink a book contract, because none of the language in a traditional book contract worked for this, right? To how you handle peer review, how you handle copy editing, right? So the process of the Alliance for Networking and Visual Culture is really giving us a lot of good questions for a next phase of the grant, knock on wood, right? To understand how university presses and archives might work together with scholars to change how we envision scholarly publishing. And if anybody wants links for these, I could send them to you. So what we're building now at USC, and we'll test out this summer, is a platform called Scalar. It's kind of an in-joke, because a scalar, mathematically, you probably know this, you engineers, right, is a force which multiplies vectors, right? So, you know, it's very punny. Humanities scholars like that. And we're really, primarily in this iteration, focused on video and visual material like photographs, although the platform is meant to be fairly media agnostic. So we're not, you know, kind of limited to video. And really hope to kind of take some of what we learned from the boutique environment of vectors and scale it much more broadly. So we're now looking for additional press and archive partners. We're partnering with several scholarly societies as the conduit to kind of help scholars begin to learn new practices for scholarly production. So we've got some kind of core principles of use embedded into the system, right? Things that, as my team, which is largely comprised of my co-editor, Steve Anderson, a really brilliant new media artist and designer named Eric Lawyer, who has some iPhone apps and other projects you may have come across, and an information designer and programmer named Craig Dietrich. You know, that's our kind of core team. And these are the kind of principles we sort of set out with and have built into the process. First, multiplicity, right? We know that one of the huge payoffs for vectors was that we didn't build the project the scholars envisioned, but we had the scholars build the projects that they envisioned with our help, right? So we had a middleware database platform that we built as middleware that the scholars had to use and work with. They put their material in it. And using that kind of database process was really new for most of the humanities scholars. But when they began to understand the relationship of the data to the front end, it was an incredible payoff for them, right? They really got at the kind of mutability of digital data in a new way. And so we want to make sure that the project builds into it that kind of capacity for multiple views, which is the thing that I think most distinguishes Scalar from existing web authoring platforms. It will be open source and extensible. The content will be freely available. You'll be able to take it out, right? Which is not true of the lovely Flash objects that comprise vectors, right? It will be agile, widget-driven, not a big turnkey solution, right? And extensible as needs change. Connected, particularly to our media archives, which have done an enormous amount of work marking up and preserving, making usable the data that we will draw, right? So that's a very important part. But also connected to users who will be able to share the material in a variety of ways. And also user-centered. It comes out of our kind of long commitment to really listening carefully to humanities scholars about what their needs are in relation to technology. So a scalar text is primarily three elements: composites, media, paths. In effect, the system treats all of these as if they're made out of the same stuff, which makes it a very flat hierarchy and allows us to capitalize on some aspects of semantic computing. The composite is the kind of basic form. It's relatively analogous to a page, and in many ways not that different from a web page or a blog post. It could draw resources from the web or from internally within a scalar text itself. Right? And then this is sort of the kind of place we begin to see the differences between a scalar text and a standard blog or WordPress site, website, right? And that has to do in the way that we perform some extra processing on the material as it comes into the text, partially in ways geared toward media analysis for our communities of scholars, right? But as scholars begin to read in the center here, the text will scroll up on the side. This is a navigational device called the Stripe that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But basically, this is a text-centered view, but the core kind of processing method of Scalar allows each composite to exist in multiple views. And this is an example of a text-driven view, but on the right, there's a more media-centric view. And the author will decide which view any given composite in a scalar text will use, but the reader could choose at will between these different views, right? So you're not locked into kind of the author's version. So the list, the grid, and the graph view have obviously very different affordances than the text or media view, allowing you to understand different content relationships. Things like the grid view really privileges pinpoint editing. The graph view is a spring graph that allows you to explore one composite's relationship to the whole in a variety of ways. Media access, comes from our archive partners and others that are kind of being negotiated now, pulling things into the text. The author is allowed, and the user, if permissions are set, to annotate media once it's pulled in. Even though it's not technically pulled in, it's still living on the archive sites. But you could both bring in the annotations that are available in a place like Showa and begin to enrich them in your own, either temporally or spatially for images. And the path component, the composite, the view, the media, and the paths allow you basically to begin to work in a chapter structure, right? But in a chapter structure that's clearly very different than the structure of the chapter of your print book. Here it's recursive and looped back on itself and allows the possibility for some more experimental modes of writing. And this was something that became quite evident through the years of work at Vectors, that as scholars were freed up from linearity, they were eager to kind of make a different series of connections than they might have done otherwise. So when you put all that together, you kind of get at the kind of core components of a new mode of multi-threaded, multimodal writing. We will support a variety of user types, and different kinds of privileges will be afforded to each of those user types. And it will begin to allow a sort of tracking through versioning of the work of reviewers, of commentators, so that you can begin to accrue credit to the people who do those other kinds of work beyond authoring. The content's all meant to be shared and repurposed. For the more adventurous authors, and we've discovered that's not usually an adjective that gets applied to humanities scholars, you could allow somebody to remix your argument or to work with the same archive of materials, say, from the Showa Foundation, and draw a different path or conclusion than your own. Most scholars want to exercise a little more control over their interpretations because that's what most humanities scholars produce, but there's no reason why they would have to do that, right? And so, mashups are quite possible out of this. These are just wireframes. I actually got today, but too late to get them in the PowerPoint, several different versions of the actual interface because we're about to use this platform in our workshop later this month from NEH. But these are just wireframes to give you sort of the basic idea of the components. The header contains a cover that you could unfold for those longing for the beautifully designed front of a book, but also a variety of information about the piece and navigation. navigation. The stripe functions sort of simultaneously as both an index and a table of contents that unfolds and drills down at a variety of levels into the different elements and into the tags that sort of drive the search for the system. And then the body is the kind of analysis. And there are a variety of features built in terms of navigations, different views, tagging, commenting, discussion. We're drawing from some of the lessons learned by Comment Press and allowing paragraph by paragraph commenting on the platforms. You could see discussion for each paragraph. If you go into the graph view in the bar that was on the right, you could see the location of where you are in a particular path and use that to navigate into different spaces. The graph view allows you to navigate in a kind of macro view, but also to zoom into more micro levels to begin to understand the kind of larger structure of a piece in relation to its individual elements. And we've created a kind of spring graph like this that lived over our middleware database tool for vectors and found that scholars actually, we created it as an editing help, right? So scholars could see where things were in the database when the databases got quite complex. But we found that scholars began to use it as a space for ideation, right? As they began to see relationships between data that they had imported into a kind of Excel spreadsheet form emerge in this in a different way, they started to understand insights they hadn't necessarily gotten to before. And occasionally a scholar would say, I created this thing and it's over here all by itself, not connected to anything. Why did I think that was important? And what does it mean about my argument that this is here and nowhere else, right? So it became a kind of really interesting metacognitive tool for the scholars as they worked through the process. The list view allows you to see kind of relationships in a different way of all the different media types. This is a kind of screen of the importing from Showa. I mean, Showa has an enormously carefully marked up set of data, right? And we want to be able to use all of the things they offer us by pulling those into the process. So I think we start to learn some things from these two different experiments. Things that those of you who work with Microsoft probably already know, right? That you shouldn't really assume that we know how people want to use data. And I think that is not something humanities scholars have been particularly open to, but I think it affords us a good opportunity. That we really want to have openness as much as possible and deep access to the data. I can imagine, and Showa is very excited about this, creating, say, a collection on memory in the Holocaust that allows 8 different scholars to co-edit a collection using some of the same or different materials, right? I think we wouldn't have figured out the way to kind of begin to scale usefully in the way that we are if we hadn't lingered for quite a while in the more experimental forms that we're in, and we have a lot of value for design and literacy. While vectors feels more experimental at the surface, Scalar is actually a more experimental platform in that its data relationships are quite flat and non-hierarchical and will allow a real fluidity. And then the templates for Scalar could begin to be built to look much like a vectors project, or they could look much like a book, affording a very kind of broad array of possibility. And now I need to stop, so I'm going to just give you a couple of quick closing thoughts, and then we'll move on, right? I think one of the things that is going to happen increasingly in the future, and having heard some of the presentations today, I'm only more convinced, is that what we now think of as a kind of separate utility of the archive or the data set and the publication, that divide is gone, right? In the future, the publication and the data will coexist. They'll be linked. They'll be robustly joined. And we need to begin to think about how we move dying institutions like university scholarly presses toward a space where they could sustain that kind of work. And that will mean presses have to be less hostile to libraries, right? That libraries have to cooperate with the presses instead of trying to kill them right away, right? And there's a lot of possibility, I think, in moving ahead as collaborators in that space, right? I think Scalar also points to us that it really matters how you represent data, how data is visualized and not just sort of any kind of representation will do. So humanities scholars and scientists, I think even maybe more especially, need to really learn from designers and graphic artists about the different affordances of the visual, right? And then I think how data is represented in terms of its relationship to other pieces of data are quite interesting. Like, we're not staking scalar on a perfect semantic future, because I'm skeptical there is one. But I think within well-defined communities of use, there's real potential to kind of the semantic. So we want to be able to take advantage of that in a flat data structure, both when we import the materials from the archives and as we afford search. So I think I'm going to stop there. And if you're a humanities scholar who wants to make a project, next summer we will be having the 3rd NEH-funded month-long Humanities Institute, and we welcome you to apply. Thanks.
Hi all. So thank you, Tara. And we're going to have a little shift here. We've just looked at, digital humanities is very much about developing platforms to really engage across broad horizontals and accelerate humanities and other areas of research. But another important role with digital humanities in my mind is that the humanist should be put in contact with the technologist and the engineer and have an opportunity to comment on that technology and help us to evolve technology that's meaningful and responsibly made. So to that end, I've invited Amit Ray to come speak for us. Amit received his PhD in English literature and language from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His areas of specialization are literary and cultural theory, colonial and post-colonial literatures and cultures, and cultural globalization. Awarded the Paul and Francena Miller Fellowship by RIT for the 2005 and 06 academic year, Professor Ray's book, Negotiating the Modern, Orientalism and Indianness in the Anglophone World, was published by Routledge in 2007. Dr. Ray has been conducting research on wikis, authorship, and authority since 2004. He has presented work on the cultural impact of wikis and in the classroom. In addition, he has been working with a group of students and faculty from around the Institute to develop an online publication that queries the intersection between technology, aesthetics, and culture. So thank you, and here is Amit.
Thank you, Donald. It's a pleasure to be here. First off, I'd like to say I don't think of myself as coming out of the digital humanities. I'm in the humanities first and foremost, but I come to digitality as a necessity insofar as I'm at an institution where we're dealing with a population that is pretty far along when it comes to digital literacies. And even those who aren't studying particular areas of computer science or information technology tend to have various kinds of coding capacities. And I discovered that within my second year. And that discovery led to a chain of further discoveries that introduced me to wikis, which when I registered what was going on, the kind of distributed phenomena of authorship on wikis, I began to see a lot of connections with the kind of work that I'd done in literary theory and criticism, but I also began to think about what the implications might be for cultural exchange in light of the kinds of technology transfer that these sorts of mechanisms allowed for, and also in light of the kinds of histories of technology transfer and of developmental economics that currently exist. So in light of that, I'm going to talk about, in a, I should say, more theoretical vein, some of these dynamics, emerging dynamics in Wikipedia. I'm sorry, I don't normally use this, so thanks, Donald.
Slideshow.
There we go. Awesome.
And start from the beginning.
Start from the beginning.
Yep.
There we go. Cool. So instead of the digital humanities, I'd like to talk about the implications for the humanities, and indeed, really for traditional forms of print, reading, and writing that are being showcased all around us as we speak, and obviously have been cause for alarm in some circles and kind of celebration in others. Humanity, that notion of the species as a whole, of something that ties all members of the species together, is of course a profound construction. And that universalizing assumption is something that we need to keep in mind, especially when you look at the fragmented nature of the humanities and the kinds of methodologies, the different kinds of methodologies that the humanities bring to bear in talking about texts, textuality, various forms of communication, and history, philosophy, and the like. Ultimately, though, this revolves around language, and language is, of course, the faculty that makes our species special, to use the adjectival version of the word. Now, what characterizes a language? Grammar, the structural relationships between signs in a system. Pragmatics, the context within which signs are used. Semantics, the content and context which gives signs meaning. And it's, I think, in that latter part, in the notion of context, where much of humanistic work has endeavored in the last 25 years and has generated certain kinds of insights about identity and about certain modernist categories, such as, say, authorship, that really challenge previous notions of these categories, and which, as I'll show, I think digitality really reinforces. And so you can see becoming manifest within digital networks the kinds of behavior that we could only theorize some 30 or 40 years ago. Orality and presence, I guess this is what they were talking about in the slides. Of course, language, according to various estimates, has been with the species from between 2 million to 40,000 years ago. But during that early stage of language, of orality, communication involved presence. And of course, the technology of writing, I hope you can see that slide. The Sumerian, this comes from our own Carey collection in RIT, the technology of writing introduced more than 5,000 years ago allowed for us to re-presence, to represent linguistic communication in materialized form, which then continued, which allowed us to continue to abstract the world that we lived in, a capacity that the symbolic nature of language allowed for in the first place. So writing is that form of representation that most of us are acquainted with. And of course, writing and reading form the basis of our identity in a liberal democratic society. Notions of citizenship, of identity, of property, of credit, and so on revolve around our capacity to read and write. And we measure the health of societies in developmental economics through the rate of literacy, right, of the general populace. And the humanities has spent its time focusing on how we go about representing our world, and of course the nature of not just inscription and description, but ultimately of how we decode and interpret various forms of representation, be they in language or other symbolic forms of exchange, visual communication, and so on. And the traditional triumvirate of the humanities, history, literature, and philosophy, have all revolved around the study of language and made reading and writing the privileged form of communication in those areas. And ultimately, this comes back to a form of encoding and decoding signs that function ultimately through analogy. The linguistic sign is one that shares a form of, shares resemblance, similarity, correspondence. And as such, our purview has been in analog code. That's not always true, and I know there are exceptions to this, but when we're talking about language, we're essentially talking about a coding system that functions through analogy. Salman Rushdie, in his novel that looks at the great tech bubble of the late 90s, and it takes place in New York, kind of wistfully records the passing of this era, when the epoch of analog, which was to say also the richness of language, of analogy, was giving way to the digital era, the final victory of the numerate over the literate. And that sensibility that numbers have taken over has been in various ways both valorized and also been a source of terror. This is an illustration that was on the cover of Time about Norbert Wiener's cybernetics back in the 50s by Boris Artsibashev. I believe he was Ukrainian, an illustrator. And this is the executive of the future. Here I'm holding in my palms a Google Droid from 2010 and a Sumerian tablet from 2400 BC. What I wanted to kind of put in your mind here was the degree to which we think of a kind of spatial correspondence, in size and so on, and that notion of writing is still there. But in that 5,000 years of history, that relationship between reading and writing has been very dynamic, and we can't simply begin to think about these things as being from print to the screen, or being from a stylus inscribed on a tablet onto then parchment or papyrus. The history of reading, as a number of media theorists have shown us, as a number of I think, psychology and a number of other fields that have examined how we read, suggests to us that reading, the history of reading and writing is incredibly dynamic, and that history needs to take into account the other forms of media that are extant at the time in which we're considering that function. So we're not just shifting from print into the digital age. In fact, in the 19th century, when photography came about, or say when the phonograph or the radio came into being, Friedrich Kittler talks about this in terms of how that existence of other forms of media, of other forms of inscription, of recording, and of transmission, transformed then the nature of reading. And we need to keep that in account, that we need to be very specific when we think about how we read and write, because that has been changing over time. And ultimately, that generates all kinds of questions about how we will read or write in 10 or 15 years. One of the questions asked of me when I first showed this slide was, well, which one will still be readable in 25 years? And I think that's a very good question. So I'm going to move on now to Wikipedia and distributed authorship, because authorship is one of these categories that in the humanities we've been talking about authorship as a composite form, that the notion of the single or the individual author is one form of authorship, one instance of authorship amongst a variety of different models. And one of the things that we've done in the humanities is, and this has been done not just in the humanities, but a lot of this work has happened in legal studies, is historicize that trajectory from which we went from a range of different kinds of authorship into what we now think of as the author, the single romantic author, which I'll describe in a moment. So this question, what is an author, is an intriguing one, especially when we put it into the context of these varied histories of reading, of writing, of the production of texts, and the sometimes volatile and dynamic history that underlies the production and dissemination of texts. Much has been made of the first century after print, comparing it, showing some overlap between the moment that we are in now. Clay Shirky recently wrote about this in a piece in the Wall Street Journal. I think it's in his book Cognitive Surplus, to talk about just the dramatic changes in the various ways in which we used to not just ascertain what mattered, what had authority, to what we could give credit, but also notions of identity, of persona, and so on, transform over time. And of course, that becomes accelerated in moments of large-scale technological flux. And the notion of authorship and identity have come to be closely associated, especially so after the Enlightenment, but particularly at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. This has quite a bit to do with the subject posited by the Enlightenment, the subject predicated on a certain kind of reason that had, subjectivity, autonomy, the ability to exercise that reason, and to utilize that reason to ascertain information about the world around them. This became more pronounced in many ways as a response to the Enlightenment in the late 19th late 18th, early 19th century, through the work not just of the British Romantics, this is Wordsworth, the German Romantics as well, Goethe, and the Schlegel brothers, and so on. But that notion of the author as creator, the author as seer, the author with a profound insight into the world around them is part and parcel of their works. And you'll see this, of course, in lyrical ballads. You'll see this in the work of people like Keats, and certainly other romantics, both philosophers, creative writers, and of course maintaining that distinction is oftentimes difficult when we're talking about some of the genres that they were working in. But the Romantic author comes to the fore at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. And of course, this is the year we're marking the 300th anniversary of the first Copyright Act, which was the Statute of Anne in 1710. And this is not a coincidence. Now, the history behind the Statute of Anne wasn't about privileging the author. That was certainly in the air. That was Romanticism was achieving a vogue and a dominance that in many ways is still with us. But the Stationers Guild, in fact, leveraged the notion of the author in an effort to secure privileges for themselves that in many ways backfired over the course of the 19th century. And maybe we can talk about that further along in questions and answers. But that notion of identity and creation is still very much with us. I'll talk about this further as we go along, and particularly the notion of individual identity and singular creativity. So creation, authorship, individuality, property all emerge through a host of complex interactions right around the same time, and become secure in the Anglo imagination, but also on the continent. Martha Woodmansey's work is wonderful in relating how the German legal system and the British legal system, the French legal system varied, but how they then kind of coalesced in bringing about this notion of the individual author. So in many ways, our imagination, the way we kind of think about cultural creativity revolves around this romantic notion that cultural production begins and ends with the individual. And when we think about things like films, right, which are just immensely collaborative, much of the notion of who creates the film comes back to the director. And as I'll go on to talk about towards the end, it's very difficult to imagine any written work produced by a single individual. You will always have a variety of different interlocutors involved, from editors to readers to collaborators and the like. And much of the editorial theory and editorial history that's been done, and I'll give you slides to point this out in a moment, point out how individuality and creativity, are not necessarily mutual. So the notion of the culture of the individual becomes secure in this, and again, I think in discussion we can move back to this notion of the individual, which is being, I think, reinforced right now in certain strains of libertarian discourse. And a shift onto the product over process. And again, there are discussions here that we can follow up on later. But ultimately, the privileging of the author over the reader, not just in the way that we assign and categorize and label and ascertain and value different cultural works, but also in how we criticize, interpret, disseminate, and so on. And this is where the humanities was stuck for the better part of the 20th century. And despite elements of formalist criticism that tried to move outside of this, to move the emphasis to the text and outside of, say, biographical intentionality and so on, this is where we remain for quite some time. In certain ways, we still do. We still offer single-author courses on Coleridge and so on. But this question, what does it matter who is speaking, is taken from Samuel Beckett's Texts for Nothing. And it emphasizes a particular moment, a debate that was going on in late structuralism, early post-structuralism in the 60s about this very issue, about the notion of the author as creator and disseminator, of work and ultimately of a kind of meaning. And this was a debate going on between Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. And Barthes wrote an essay in 66, 67 called The Death of the Author, where basically he inverted, in a kind of hyperbolic manifesto, he inverted this relationship, talking about the death of the author as a means for liberating the reader. And he was using the formalist insights about language and the text to make this reversal. Foucault comes around not long afterward in 68 and responds with, what is an author? And what Foucault does here is he takes into account that long and varied history of authorship in order to highlight the changing nature of authorship under different regimens, under different circumstances, changing laws, technologies, and so on. And to ask this question, what does it matter who is speaking? Right? Why do we place so much emphasis on the notion of identity? Why do we invest that with credibility, with truth? And ultimately, why does that become the locus of a kind of evidence as well as a kind of identity? And so what he wants to do, and what he lays out, is a shift from the corporeal author to the notion of an author function. And then lays out a series of questions that we should ask of different types of discourse that will continue to emerge under the kinds of dynamic circumstances that existed then and which seem to be accelerating now. What are the modes of existence of this discourse? Where has it been used? How can it circulate? And who can appropriate it for him or herself? What are the places in it where there's room for possible subjects? And who can assume these various subject positions? Now, Wikipedia, and earlier today someone referenced Wikipedia as the greatest creation in human history. Are they here? Because that was awesome, and I'm awesome. Oh, okay. Wikipedia has certainly been a revelation for many people, especially people in the humanities who have become attuned to that kind of modernist hierarchical notion of establishing credibility, of peer review, of ultimately the very basis of scholarly life, forms of attribution, acknowledging credit, much of which then goes back again to notions of the individual. In Wikipedia, and I've highlighted the tabs across the top, you have, of course, a dynamic and changing text where the various buttons allow for new forms of subjectivity and interaction. Of course, the edit button, of which much is made, allows for collaborative opportunity. But people don't, and I'm writing on this right now, people don't spend enough time talking about the discussion page, which is the meta space, right? Where the discussion about the content of the page is taking place. And really, from everything that I've seen, is the best place to ascertain the quality of the article. The more vigorous the discussion, the more likely that the article is going to be of higher quality. This was exactly what was missing in the Siegenthaler episode from a few years ago when someone put in erroneous information about an editor, a retired editor at Gannett. The problem was no one read his page, so no one changed it. He was the one who drew all the attention to it, and then it was promptly changed. But this is another important aspect which I'll talk about in light of the media circumstances that we find ourselves in today. Despite the rapid changes that have been taking place, in many ways one could argue that the continuous present, the ever-present now of the kind of cultural production that's been going on over the last 30 years that has been called postmodernism by critics and detractors and celebrants alike, seems to not be going away, right? All of the great hopes for the web and so on aren't increasing our ability to build and establish context that goes back in time. Wikipedia represents, in this way, it is a remarkable achievement, a continuous archive of every iteration on a particular article, and every article has every iteration going back to the moment of its creation. And so the subject position that we found ourselves in the era of print which was changing over time, but was static in this sense that the mechanics of print made it rather difficult to conceive of yourself as more than a consumer. And so you're taking in the text, you're consuming the text, you're reading the text, but you're not creating the text. And your subject position anytime you go on a Wikipedia page is radically different insofar as you can edit or reshape that text. And so you have the capacity then to assume a variety of subject positions that weren't necessary, or if they were available to you, it was only in theory, not in practice. And so this gives us what Peter Jassy calls a form of serial collaboration, which in its best instances provides for continuous updating, continuous monitoring, the ability to remove vandalization, to remove information within seconds or minutes. And this is a visualization from Wattenberg and Villegas from several years ago. What we have then is a form of distributed authorship that we can actually begin to track and register changing instances of discourse over time. This is the article on evolution. I'm going back to the Romantics now. This is William Wordsworth composing a poem between the lines of a page of Coleridge's poem. Now, much has been made of this particular page in that the influences, the subject matter doesn't seem to be initially terribly derivative or responsive, but as you go through, you can actually begin to register the kind of resonance and the influence that's there. Much of Coleridge's work, or much of Wordsworth's work, kind of came in this kind of patch form, and in addition, Coleridge kept notebooks where he cut and pasted, and unfortunately they were rather sloppy, and much has been made of his borrowings from German Romanticism, particularly Schopenhauer, in developing his unique and individual philosophical system. So in these instances, in these linguistic acts, we have forms of distributed creation, which has often been referred to as crowdsourcing. And I don't like this word, and I'll tell you why. Only insofar as that notion of the crowd speaks to a kind of unruly, anarchic sort of, and not anarchy in the sense of kind of localized forms of organization, like Kropotkin theorized and that occurred in Barcelona during the war, but of kind of chaos. I think that the anthropology of free software, and there's been some incredible work going on here from people like Chris Kelty and from Gabriella Coleman at NYU, provides a lot of clues as to how these communities function. And I want to move into that discussion to perhaps find better terms for what we're talking about in terms of authorship on Wikipedia. Here is one of the terms that has been used is, well, first to speak of that anthropology of free software, it's not unruly and anarchic and unorganized and ad hoc. Rather, it's highly organized, radically transparent. Things are meticulously documented. And if you go to MediaWiki, you'll see an autoethnography that would be inspiring to any cultural anthropologist. MetaWiki, I'm sorry, not MediaWiki, as the Wikipedia has recorded its own activities voluminously, theorizing it all the while, as well as meritocratic, right? One's ability, not one's identity, but one's ability garners one credit and authority within these communities. Mitch Kapoor, who developed Lotus 123, spoke of this as massively distributed collaboration. Yochai Benkler, who's done important work on the legal and economic and the legal and political economy of the commons, speaks of this as commons-based peer production. And much of that comes back to notions of that of a kind of freedom that is about liberty, right? This is why we have the term floss, which is another unruly term. Libre, a word that we don't use in English, gives us a better sense, because for us, most of us think of free as in beer. And free software, then, and free software is, of course, the basis for the unintentional, I think, basis for the development of Wikipedia, then becomes the grounds for all kinds of further creation. And so back to this notion of what are the implications for thinking about binary code and the software and the platform in relationship to natural language, and what's happening as you get people who are proficient in both, and you find advanced programming languages that are rhetorically encoded so that they address not just a machine interlocutor, but a human interlocutor as well. Chris Kelty has the best term for this phenomenon, and he speaks of this as recursive publics. And these are publics that constitute a community where not only do they generate the terms and conditions of exchange, but they can actually generate and modify and extend or change the platform for that exchange as well. And that's quite remarkable when you think of the kinds of behaviors then that you're finding in say, game modding, or in other places where people are proficient in developing not just the communication, but the tools for that communicative exchange. So back to notions of community. Before I go on, and I don't, wow. Yeah, okay. The digital palimpsest. The palimpsest is in for manuscript culture, the various texts that lay underneath the vellum when you took off, because the parchment or the vellum was so valuable that texts were erased and reinscribed. And art history is doing this now, because this was true of Canvas as well. And so a lot has been gleaned on the texts that lie underneath, and the wiki is a digital palimpsest. This is the third and the most important part, and I'll fly through this.
Take 6 minutes, we'll do short.
Okay. Wikipedia currently exists in more than 270 languages, and according to Alexa, as of May 2010, was the 6th most visited site on the web. This is the symbol for the Wikimedia Foundation, a group that promotes the free software that runs not just Wikipedia, but a host of other projects that we don't normally think of, but which are rather important and are becoming increasingly influential. All of these function under copyleft. So this is not open source software, this is free software, meaning that it leverages copyright and is radically open. These are the articles, the top 25 most represented languages on Wikipedia. You'll note in the top 10, the only non-European language is Japanese. Chinese, the most spoken language in the world, ranks at 12. 30 languages have more than 100,000 entries. 61 languages have more than 10,000 entries. And 96 languages have more than 1,000 entries. And what's been remarkable over the last 3 years is the degree to which the coordination of human translation has occurred on Wikipedia, much like the kind of self-reflexive, ethnographic motivation that drives the self-analysis going on in MetaWiki. You see a remarkably organized approach to human translation on Wikipedia. Here's Meta Babylon. And it gives you ways of getting started in a variety of different languages, ways of asking for requests. And if you look at any other part of Wikipedia, this is how articles are organized. There are various projects and sub-projects, all of which have different internal organization. This is Brugger's image of Babylon. This is the constructivist tower. Falcon. No, I'm forgetting his last name, I'm sorry. That was proposed in 1917 for the Leninist revolution. It was never built. It was meant to be 400 meters tall. And this is Electroboutique's iPhone tower, building the tower to God, man ascending to into the divine. All of these celebrate the end of history, a kind of a moment where ideology ends, to use Fukuyama's term, where we've come to a place where humanity shares the same ideological proclivities. Each of these cases, of course, demonstrates how wrong we have been, especially with an iPhone. Sources for translation, we need to keep in mind, and as people who do translation currently know rather well, sources of translation for translation are languages of power. If you look at the print industry, print is dominated by Anglo translation. So things get translated out of English, relatively few things get translated back into English. So translation goes in one direction. And this is what's going on in Wikipedia right now, unfortunately. Aside from some commonalities between shared languages, say Eastern European languages, most of the activity is distributed outwards from the Anglosphere. And that has been seeded recently by Google to the tune of $2 million in an effort to get less populated languages better represented. They want to translate English language articles into those languages. Natural language, I'm going back to this question of language because it's very important how we think about computation and the mechanics of computation, as opposed to how we think about linguistic interaction from a changing view within linguistics and certainly from the perspective of most in the humanities. Let me just quickly move on, though, to Chomsky's universal grammar, which has been so important to the notion of computer science because it allows for a kind of deterministic model or mechanism for thinking about language. Unfortunately, that hasn't been borne out. Consider the reboot of artificial intelligence that took place this year. Empirical work as of late has gone back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is a relativistic notion of human language. This is Lyra Boroditsky's article in Edge. She's done quite a bit of empirical work on how language not just constructs our behavior and influences how we interact, but that different languages think and behave differently because speakers of different languages think and behave differently because of those languages. This is very controversial, and there are reasons for it being dismissed years ago, in large part because it was used to essentialize characteristics of people. We need to keep, so the Arab mind, or the example that's always used, is that of the Hopi and their conception of time. But are we dealing here with the kind of linguistic activity that's going on, with the assumptions about linguistic parity, with a kind of linguistic imperialism? Translation is not a faithful act of reproduction. Translation involves interpretation. And so what we need to ask are, what kinds of communities are we dealing with? Because what we're dealing with here now is the internet and the politics of development. We need to think about the history of those politics, like the Green Revolution, which was top-down, universalist and totalizing, techno-deterministic, and had unintended consequences that continue through to the present day. Yes, people were fed, but they were also made subservient in a host of ways. So this techno-utopian future that we think about is mirrored in things like access to knowledge and one laptop per child, which I'm just jumping through. And both of these basically reinscribe the same universalizing impulses. They seem to have not learned the history. And I'll leave it very quickly. We can't believe that information and access automatically convert into empowerment, right? That there is an irreducible diversity of languages and that we design heterogeneity. I'll finish with this. The humanities, like all disciplines, must recognize the shift to digitality, and in doing so, recognize the intermingling between natural and machine languages, and the forms of interaction produced by the interactive web, as Tara pointed out, necessitate new ways of understanding modern concepts such as authorship, identity, property, credit, expertise, and knowledge. But let's think beyond development in our design. And this is meant to be a generative critique. Despite network technologies long predate the web, the liberal humanist subject continues to serve as the locus of identity. And I would argue, despite all evidence to the contrary, never has our identity been as distributed and manifestly so as it is now. And the proliferation of communications technologies threatens to reinforce rather than undermine long-standing histories of colonialism and domination. Like economic imperialism, cultural imperialism displaces heterogeneity and complexity with mechanistic, undifferentiated, essentializing approaches. And these approaches extend not just to technology, but to information, knowledge, and what ultimately constitutes as understanding. Thanks. Do we have any time for questions? 2 minutes.
We do. I'm sorry I had to rush you there. You did a great job, though, bringing it all to a close. Yes, so we have a couple questions. Please.
Thank you. This is a question perhaps to both speakers. I mean, observing my colleagues in the arts and in the humanities, the pattern of their publications are very different. Many more single author, many more monographs, many more books, and I don't know whether or not it is good for discourse more generally to perhaps encourage a shift away from that. Indeed, that in fact, one might argue quite the reverse, that one would want to see the sciences, perhaps computer science, move further towards more monographs, more books, more single author publication. But there seems to be but inherent in many of the digital technologies we use for publication appears to be an atomizing of the stuff of publication, which might drive things and reading, which might drive one in an opposite direction. So I'm interested in your reactions to that observation.
Well, certainly Nicholas Carr would agree with you, right? As he argues that the internet's just making us stupid, right? It's worth noting that in a project like Alex Juhas's, the YouTube project, there's about as many words in that project as a book on the subject, right? So it's not as if there's less content, but it is atomized, right? It's a less long-form arced argument, and I think if we were to entirely lose the long-form arced argument that's been really important for humanities scholarship for a very long time, that would indeed be a loss. But I don't think that it's an either-or question. There is a question about whether that long form of publishing could be sustained for more than another decade in the forms that it exists right now, right? Because it's not profitable and it's not sustainable in the model of the university press right now. So, but I too love books. I read them voraciously on my Kindle. I actually still write them, So, but I think there's room for multiple kind of formats. And as someone who studies the visual, I don't see text as the only format that could carry valuable interpretation or information for us.
I couldn't agree more, but I should also point out the degree to which policies, about tenure, promotion, how we acquire credit, authority, and so on within our academic institutions need to change. And despite calls from the MLA along these lines, because we are pushed to publish, all of us, in whatever field we're in. And that's not necessarily good for scholarship, particularly in the humanities, where I think deep scholarship is incredibly important. The ability to spend quite a bit of time in the archive to let projects gestate for 8 or 10 years, which you don't have the luxury of doing, even after tenure. And so it will have to change at the level of institutional policies and procedures, as well as reform within publishing models.
So, can we do one more? All right, we'll do one more. We are over, though.
Just one more. Thanks so much for your presentations. I really appreciated them, and I want to call attention to one major difference between the two of them, and then ask basically a question, which is a point of information. And that's that in your presentation, you're looking at something that has brought great numbers of people to a certain site. And the form of it is a very traditional form. It is the neutral voice of the encyclopedia that we've come to know since the 18th century. On the other hand, Tara, you and your team, including Wendy, have been experimenting with something that is multimodal and expressive and taking things in really I think, a very exciting and radically new direction. And I just applaud, actually, how much you've achieved in the last couple of years. It's enormous. So here's my question. I am very distressed that the form of the scholarly book is one that really is not accessible to people. It's in libraries. The public can't go to libraries. These books aren't searchable. And most of the databases or something like JSTOR are only available to people through libraries, can't be accessed by a public, very expensive for independent scholars. And so my question, which is a point of information, is how are your presses, the ones that you're working with, thinking about the famous business plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and they don't have answers, right? But the Scholarly Communication Institute, which is a space where Wendy and I connected with our collaborators and began the work we do with the Mellon Foundation, this summer, actually starting Wednesday, and next summer is having 2 kind of 4-day-long summer kind of workshops, bringing this summer experimental publishing together, and next summer the presses, right? So a few folks like Lynn Withey, who unfortunately is now retiring, and Ellen Farron at MIT Press are really thinking in some kind of interesting and innovative ways, but they, really know they don't have any workable answers yet, which is why I think places like the Mellon Foundation are really trying to kind of help ease presses into collaborative models when that has not been their strong suit in the past, right? So.
And you could also take the tack that Martha Nussbaum has taken in her most recent book about why is it that the profit motive is the driving force in what we're doing, and to begin to point out the ways in which that it undermines really the kinds of access that we hope to seek by driving the kinds of fragmentation, hyper-specialization, and so on that characterize all of the academy, not just the humanities.
I was listening to the great presentation this morning about the Data One project and kind of collaborating, kind of massive, what you do with sort of massive data sets, and wondering what the kind of citizen humanities scholar equivalent would be to the citizen scientist, right? Because I think the citizen scientist is this really interesting emergent phenomenon. And I think the humanities, as much as I value a lot of the language we've developed over the last 30 years to do the work that we do, we bear some of the responsibility, not just, not having our books in digital form, for people not reading our books, right? Because they're written in languages that citizen humanities scholars can't understand. And, so there's something to be said about
To go back to that, I like to use the term philologist to characterize a lot of the activity that goes into the popular culture entries on Wikipedia, because if you go into the discussions about the beginnings of a particular figure, say in The Simpsons, you will actually find this genealogy that's just remarkably detailed, going back through several iterations to some local television program in Vancouver in the late 60s. And that kind of work, that kind of intellectual activity is going on. And Gramsci's term is the organic intellectual. What we need to do is valorize that. And I think these kinds of spaces allow for that to occur.
Thank you so much.